managing anything.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will slowly start. I will start off with saying bon appetit and enjoy. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Zen and what you can do in Zen to improve your image quality or to improve your image acquisition. And there's actually four main subjects I briefly want to touch. I'm not going into much detail in most of them. If they seem interesting, I would propose to just pass by CBI and then we can discuss in more detail. But I hope to give an impression of what you can do with Zen, where it can improve things for you. So for example, I will start with part about acquisition. It's only two subjects in there, followed by some analysis and visualization of your data. Then there's also a short mention about molecular dynamics analysis. It's not commonly used, so I wanted to touch it because it could be of interest to you. And then also about how to process the data or what would be interesting in processing. So first of all, with Zen Blue, so this does not concern the confocal microscopes or the light sheet or the ELIRA system. Zen Blue runs at CBI on our Observer Z1 sub-observer and on the Axial Zoom microscope. With Zen 2.3 now, we have a possibility to run scripts automatically after image acquisition. So for those that are, for example, doing apotome image acquisition with both systems, you know that with the apotome you get your raw data image and then you have to process this data and then you have the final image. There's always this processing step which takes time. So there is a script available, the apotome processing script, which would run automatically after image acquisition with apotome. Skip this step. Would just make things faster for you, would make things easier. Additionally, there's also a possibility to run automatic stitching. I also have a script for automatic deconvolution of the data. If you're running image analysis, once you have your wizard, you have to define a script with the wizard for image analysis. You can also run this automatically. This all occurs on the acquisition PC. Keep that in mind. So it might take time. For example, deconvolution is a slow process, so you would have to book enough time. But stitching is definitely something I think most of you can use, and the apotome processing as well. If you have other ideas, something that you regularly do after image acquisition, that you do it manually, just let me know. We can look into it, or we can also create a script for you more specifically. Scripts can run before the real acquisition starts. This is probably not so often used, especially the script running acquisition. Now another topic I wanted to touch is, and this goes for all the confocal microscopes, is the lambda scanning. For those of you who know lambda scanning, very often it's used for overlapping dyes, or if you want to exclude, for example, autofluorescence in your sample. What's actually happening is you scan the complete spectrum at once, and then you ask the software to separate the autofluorescence from your 2, 3, 4, 5 dyes that are in your sample, instead of defining very small band passes that are being detected with the system. The main advantage here is that it's not only limited to excluding autofluorescence or dividing dyes that are overlapping, such as, for example, Alexa 488 and Alexa 514. Those you cannot separate based on filters, but you can separate with lambda scanning. The main advantage here is that you can also scan like 4, 5, 6 dyes in one run. So you only have one scan, and then the software will separate those dyes for you. This can save a lot of time instead of scanning first my blue, then my red, and then my green, and then my yellow, and so on. So you can really speed up your image acquisition 3, 4, 5 times. Now, you can separate the dyes offline on one of the PCs in the corridor. You can also separate them while scanning if you work on the LSM 880 or on the 710 ELIRA. This makes the system actually very fast. So here, for example, this is a sample that we had with another customer where we separated 10 dyes in one sample. So you know we have usually 3 or 4 dies. That's limited to it, because otherwise there's too much overlap and you cannot separate one die from the other. With lambda scanning, you can nicely define the separation and nicely define the dies. So how does this work? Here, for example, we have a cell expressing GFP and YFP. We're going to look pixel by pixel how much GFP spectrum is contributing to that pixel and how much the YFP spectrum is contributing to that pixel in terms of intensity. So to separate it, we're going to have first 2 references. So you need 2 samples, one which is only GFP possible, one positive, one which is only YFP positive. For each of those samples, we define precisely the spectrum of the GFP and YFP respectively. These spectra are then saved in the database of the system. And then next, while scanning the cell with both fluorescent proteins present, the software can then separate the GFP from the YFP directly or immediately. So this gives you a lot of more potential in terms of staining, but it also gives you lots of more potential in terms of speeding up your image acquisition. So here, for example, you see a video of a live spheroid with, in this case, there were 5 dyes in there. So we just scan one single scan per time point, and then we separate them afterwards based on the spectra. Another interesting part of the Zen software, I already discussed this in the previous talk about image analysis. I just wanted to touch base about it again. In Zen software, also in the light version, which you can download for free, you can apply interactive analysis. So with interactive analysis, on your image, you mark the region of interest, and automatically you have then the intensity calculated for that region of interest. You can also have in the data table the perimeter, the area, and lots of other parameters automatically measured. You can draw more than 99 regions of interest per image. You can also do this on time lapses, and the software will provide you a data table per time point for that region of interest, or in Z-steps. Similar to the interactive measurement, which is manual handling, you also have access to automated analysis. Now, this is only available on the computers in the corridor or on the systems that you're working on. With automated analysis, you can create your own script for image analysis and then have your images or hundreds of images analyzed in batch automatically. Here I would like to refer to the previous talk, which is online on YouTube somewhere, I have no idea where. You can ask Doug for that, or just pass by and we can help you further with that as well. A bit less known would be the kymograph. In a kymograph, what's happening is if you have a time-lapse image, as you can see here, so this is just one time point image, you draw a line over it and you show the intensity distribution over the line. Now, since it's a time-lapse, the intensity distribution of this line can be shown as a kymograph, can be shown over time. This can also help you to calculate how many cells are moving through, for example, a vessel, blood vessel, over time, so you can easily count them in the time lapse. What you see here at the bottom, this is the profile distance showing you the intensity. On the y-axis, you see the time lapse basically. So that's, as mentioned, it's interesting to show cell motility. In Zen Black, only on the Lyra or on the workstations in the corridor, you can also do particle tracking. It's a little bit more limited than real particle tracking in other software modules, but it can be handy to get already a rough idea or a rough estimate of the data. So also here, if you have a time lapse, you can then nicely show per trace how far it has been moving, how tortuous the vision was, etc. And regarding dynamics analysis, here the point is really to define, for example, the KD coefficient, how fast the diffusion coefficient, how fast your molecules are moving. Are two molecules in my live cells interacting with each other? Do I have cleavage ongoing? Do I have colocalization ongoing? This is all about live cell imaging, where I do not care that much about my image itself, but I want to get some dynamics analysis data from it. The first part would be FCS, fluorescence correlation spectroscopy. In FCS, what we do is we do not scan our image, we actually park the laser beam in one specific spot in the cell. Because of the pinhole and the objective, we only illuminate a small volume, which is this ellipsoid here. While it's parked, all the molecules that are now moving freely in my sample, once in a while, one of those molecules will pass through this volume. Since this is excitation light, the moment that they pass through the volume, they will start emitting fluorescence. Based on the size of the molecule, this intensity can be high, can be low. Based on the size of the molecule, the speed that it passes through the volume can mean that it's a big or it's a small molecule, or it's moving just fast and slow. And from this we can then extract the, as mentioned, the diffusion coefficient. FCS can be interesting to define concentration. So if you want to know how many molecules are actually present in the cell, what's the concentration, it can be defined to define the motility, whether colocalization is ongoing, enzymatic kinetics, cleavage, for example, can be checked with it, or also binding of molecules. FCS can go very far. As mentioned, protein-protein interactions, membrane mobility, nanoviscosity, diffusion coefficient, etc. This can be performed on any of our LSM 880s. Now, the disadvantage of FCS is that with FCS you can only measure at one point at a time in the cell. For example, I focus on the nucleus, I measure in the nucleus. Afterwards, I move to the cytoplasm and I have to measure it again in the cytoplasm. And I have to do this a couple of times to actually average the data and minimize the error on the readouts. With raster image correlation spectroscopy, I can actually get this data on a complete scanned image. The idea behind this is that every image that you acquire on a confocal microscope is actually a time lapse on its own. Since it's a point scanning, every pixel that you scan is different in place and in time within the same image. So by correlating all the pixels with each other, you can also extract dynamics data from this. Similar to FCS, except that FCS can even detect chemical changes, where the molecule would be changing direction, for example. This is something that can occur extremely fast. RIX is a bit more for the slower processes of movement of molecules within the cell, exchange between the nucleus and the cytoplasm, and so on. As a third option, with the confocal microscopes, with the LSM 880, you can also define the number and brightness. And with number and brightness, you can measure whether polymerization is ongoing. What you do with number and brightness, to say it in very simple terms, if I have a molecule and I have a monomer, my monomer gives one photon. If I have a dimer, I would have two photons. Dimer would give me three photons. So basically what you do is per pixel, you count how many photons are coming from the pixel. You have to calibrate your system, but then it would be easy afterwards to define where monomerization, where dimerization, etc. is ongoing within the cell. Now we go over to the processing functions. And one very interesting aspect or possibility with the processing functions is this preview tab. When in Zen you go to the processing tab, you have to choose an input image. Below the input image, there is always also an output image. When you open this window of the output, you see a button preview. As soon as you click this preview button, you get a window overlaying your original image. And it actually shows you what the result is from the processing step that you're applying. So for example, if you're applying deconvolution or if you're applying smoothing, you immediately get to see in the overview image the result of the smoothing on a small part of the image before you have to apply it to the complete image. This can save you time, and this can definitely help you in defining the correct parameters before you apply the processing to the complete image or hundreds of images. I don't know if you can see it nicely, the difference here. So this was the deconvolution. This is the regular white field image, and here you see the result of the deconvolution. Now, on top of the preview image, you also have 4 possibilities. You can define a custom size for the preview window, so you can make it smaller or larger. You can have half view, which is half of the image is being processed, the other half not. You can have a full view, which is basically applying it to the complete image, or you can have a split view where you see the original image next to the processed image. Personally, I like a lot the custom sized image because it really shows you immediately what you will get. On all of the systems in the corridor and on the Zen Blue system, so the observer Z1, the sub-observer, and the Axios Zoom, you also have a possibility to run deconvolution. In the future, when the cell discoverer will be here, we also will have deconvolution on that system, GPU-based, so much faster, and an additional computer with GPU processing as well. Why GPU processing? Because it's about 20 to 80 times faster than the regular deconvolution. So instead of waiting a couple of hours to have a final image, it will now be a matter of seconds to minutes. Now with Zen Blue, and Zen Blue is also installed on all of the confocal microscopes, don't forget about that. We always use Zen Black for confocal microscope acquisition, but you can run Zen Blue simultaneously, and you can drag one image from Zen Black into Zen Blue for processing. So on all of these systems, you also have access to free deconvolution, which means the regularized inverse filter, fast iterative, but not the constraint iterative. Constraint iterative is the module which is only available on the systems in the corridors. Now to run deconvolution, and why would I run deconvolution? To run deconvolution, you need to have at least 1,000 gray values. More is even better. You have to have a good signal to noise, which means low background, low noise in your sample, and a high signal. But you can also prepare the image before you run the deconvolution. And that's what I want to discuss first before we go deeper into deconvolution. So here you see an example of how you can really have image improvement. Don't be mistaken, deconvolution is not only meant for wide field imaging, as you will see later on. You can also really further improve your confocal images, your two-focal images, your light sheet images, and so on. Now, prior running the deconvolution, check whether the stack correction cannot help you. Stack correction can reduce the noise in your image. You can also have cover for decay in the image, which means while I'm imaging, I might have some fluorescence decay, bleaching ongoing in the next Z stack or Z planes that I still have to image because I'm illuminating everything. Or you can also cover for flickering. Now, flickering is not going to happen here because all our light sources for fluorescence are or lasers or LED based. Flickering is really something for the old-fashioned light bulbs for fluorescent imaging. But the first two, the background correction and the decay, can definitely be of help. With background subtraction is available in the stack correction, is also available in the deconvolution itself. There is an additional method solely focused on background subtraction with more parameters that you can set. So I would always look at this one to improve your image. So with that you can remove the smooth background, or you can correct for uneven illumination, which occurs very often in wide-field imaging. Less in confocal imaging because you're zoomed in a little bit more. Now when applying the background subtraction, it is important to set the radius in the parameters, and the radius should always be larger than the non-background object in your sample. So if you have a cell there of, for example, 100 pixels, your background correction should be set to about 101 or be larger. So as mentioned, here in this method you have more functionality than in the C-step correction. You can also apply channel alignment in Design Blue software. Channel alignment is something that we always advise. Actually, you have to do it when you use ELIRA for super resolution. What happens is that even with the best planar chromat objectives that are made, you might still have, below the diffraction limit, you might still have a certain shift between the different dyes. Here, for example, on the left side, I don't know if you can see it well, you see that it's one bead which is colored for green and red. You see that the red is slightly shifted from the green. Also here on top you can see it. After applying the channel alignment, all the channels will be nicely aligned on top of each other. We do have a protocol on the CBI website that you can download. To apply the channel alignment, you do need tetraspec beads, so 4 color beads, to first acquire an image, to define how much the shift is, and then this shift can be applied, or these values can be applied to your real image. This is less of interest for wide field images, for confocal images, or to photon images, because there we are limited to the diffraction limit. But once you go to structured illumination, to palm D-storm, or even to airy scan, you can apply this shift. So it can be really helpful to improve your image quality, and especially of high importance when you do super resolution colorization analysis. Now, deconvolution itself, there are a huge amount of parameters that one can set in our deconvolution module. First of all, it starts off with normalization. You can choose between clip and automatic. Now, automatic is one that I would use for quality. Clip is the one that you need to choose if you want to quantify your data afterwards for intensity quantification. With automatic, it will automatically adjust, and you don't really know how much it has been adjusting your intensities. But you will get a nice result in the end. It's just the image will be nice. You cannot really trust it anymore for image analysis. That's when you choose clip. The strength slider, this will define the regularization and the strength of restoration that you apply to your image. When set to weak, there will be hardly any restoration. When set to strong, you will have a high restoration, a much more precise generalization, it's called in deconvolution. But you have to be aware that once set to high, you can also create some artifacts. You might eat too much of the signal away that you have initially. And you can get, for example, some holes or bites out of your image that you will see. Now there's also a convergence curve available in the deconvolution module, which can definitely show you how well deconvolution is being applied to your image. As you know, deconvolution is an iterative process. I'm going to apply it once up to 40 times, and I run Lucy Richardson deconvolution even up to 2,000 times. Now this conversion curve shows you nicely how the improvement is going, and we have to go to a limit of 0. So we start here on top. You see the blue and the red line are nicely going down. As long as they keep on going down, it's okay, we have a very good restoration. As you can see here for the green though, we have a very good restoration very fast, but then it's going bad. So your image is losing quality there. Now in this example, it's improving again afterwards. But this line going back up, this is something that should be prevented. And that's also a setting that you can choose, is how much or how often do I want an iterative process to happen. So instead of maybe 40 times, I would stop here at 10 times and then I skip this last part. And still my image improvement will be very good. So that's what's shown here. This is a restoration which is going very well, and then suddenly it's going completely in the faulty direction. So then you have to set your iterative process value, in this case, to 10 instead of 20. Now for deconvolution, it's also important to oversample, if possible, if you have time for it. Because the more oversampling you can do, 2 times up to 4 times, I would not go higher than that, you will really improve the image resolution and the restoration quality. Also in the deconvolution module in the PSF, that you can check your sampling. And always the sampling values here next to the channels itself, they will show you how much oversampling you apply. So always strive for a value of 2 or more. By default, a theoretical PSF point-spread function is applied for the deconvolution processing. You can also require a PSF yourself with beats, and then use this PSF, it's called an experimental PSF, for the restoration of your data. Every system and with every different objective has a specific PSF by its own. So that's why an experimental PSF will always give you nicer results than the regular theoretical PSF. Because a 20 times on LSM 880 number 1 will not give the same PSF as LSM 880 number 2. But the theoretical one will be similar for both. So the experimental not. I've also written a while ago a PowerPoint on deconvolution with Zen 2.3. If you're interested in running deconvolution, feel free to pass by or email me and I can provide you this talk as well. Now for wide field imaging, here I'm going to discuss a little bit more in detail when and where you can make changes to the deconvolution parameters. For wide field imaging, it all depends on the image quality. Well, that's actually also the case of confocal. You have to have a good signal to noise. Constrained iterative as a deconvolution algorithm will give you the best results. Typically for wide field imaging, you would leave automatic on unless you really want to do intensity analysis. And if you have a good signal to noise, you can set a strength to a value of 7 or 8. The parameters here on the bottom, in more than 90% of the cases for wide field imaging, you can just leave them as is. Now here you see an example of image improvement of a confocal image. Confocal images by default are always a little bit noisy. You have these speckle images. Especially when you zoom in, you will notice this. This is just because it's confocal imaging. With lasers, you make an optical section, you have some noise from the detectors. Even if you try to prevent the noise as much as possible, it will still be there. Deconvolution can very nicely improve the results there. Now, what's important for confocal image deconvolution are the values here below. Here, set it to analytical. First order will define that it's a noisy image, which is a confocal image, is noisy. And then it will actually result in a smoother and nicer restoration of your images. They're still confocal, so you're not creating new objects in deconvolution. You just get a nicer signal to noise, get a slightly smoother image as well. Also, two-photon imaging can be improved dramatically. For that, you have to make some, you have to overrule some settings because a confocal two-photon image is not detected automatically by the deconvolution module. So first of all, you have to click here on override. Once you click on override, you can choose here not confocal microscope, but conventional microscope. And in the bottom drop down, you get to choose whether it's wide field or whether it's two-photon imaging. So choose there two-photon and add the correct wavelength, because the correct wavelength is currently not automatically detected for two-photon images yet. This will come in the future. The strength slider, don't set it too strong, more like a value of 3 or 4. But you see here in the example how well deconvolution can restore your images, even if you have weak signal. What is important here, if you have weak signal, is the mean of input value instead of the first estimate, and instead of, as mentioned before, first order for confocal images, you choose second order. Also, what can happen is that the conversion curve is not nicely going down, but will have some bumps. Keep in mind, as long as it's going down, it is improving, so you're good to go there. So here is the second order choice and the mean of input. On the LSM 880s, you can run the system also in so-called photon counting mode. For very, very weak signals, where normally you would have to push up your laser power like 50, 60, 70%, you can switch the detectors from regular imaging to photon counting mode. Photon counting mode typically is very, very noisy because you have very little signal. And also there, the deconvolution software can definitely help in improving the signal a lot. As you can see here on this image, here is the inset of the deconvolution versus the very noisy photon counting image. Now here, deconvolution will take a little bit longer because it has to look for all data possible in the sample, in the image itself. And we're also going to choose line search instead of analytical. Line search searches a bit deeper, longer, and better, but it will also increase the deconvolution time. Also very important, number of iterations, where typically we would take 20 or 40. Reduce the iterations to 2, 3, or 4 values. It does not need many iterations at all. It does need to search very well in the data that's being provided to have a nice restoration. Now there's also something called like super resolution deconvolution. With super resolution deconvolution, people tend to close down the pinhole beyond the 1 area unit value, and then they deconvolve to get super resolution images. You can get a similar resolution as you can get with AireScan, but AireScan will be much, much more sensitive than deconvolution by closing down the pinhole. If you close down the pinhole, you will have much less light passing through to the detectors. You will have to increase the laser power, so you have more bleaching, more phototoxicity ongoing. And you also have to keep in mind that once you have a cell, for example, like this laying on the cover slip, where the nucleus is, it's a little bit thicker, there's more volume of fluorophore. This volume will be detected still, even if you close down the pinhole. But the weaker philopodia, or the weaker cytoplasm, etc., might be skipped because there's just not enough light coming through my pinhole anymore. So when you apply the deconvolution to this image, you might have a nice, very, very sharp image and you have super resolution. Keep in mind that you're not necessarily imaging everything on the sample either. And this is where AireScan blinks out, because AireScan detects nearly all the light coming from the sample. Whereas So it opens up the peephole to detect the light and then give you super resolution image. So that means that also the iris scan is much more sensitive. So if possible, I would always suggest to use iris scan as a detector for very weak samples, especially for live cell imaging, very important. But of course, super resolution deconvolution is also possible, and we can also do it with our deconvolution module. Now here is an example of a photon-counted image with the pinhole closed down. You see this is the original photon-counted image. It's very noisy, you can hardly see any structures. And then you can see the result after running the deconvolution. So you have a very strong restoration ongoing, thanks to the special deconvolution parameters, thanks to the settings there that have been found. And here you see a similar image as acquired with iris scan. Now what's important to know here is that similar image with iris scan is acquired with about 4 to 5 times less laser power. And if you zoom in onto the image, you see that structures on the iris scan image are much nicer, as where with the deconvolution and the pinhole closed, parts of the structures are simply not restored because they have not been detected before. So that's very important given to keep in mind. In terms of image representation of Z-stacks, very often we use the MIP, MIP, or maximum intensity projection. One of the disadvantages of a maximum intensity projection is that all the pixels within the Z-stack, all the same pixels laying on top of each other, the intensities will be summed up. So you easily end up with oversaturated pixels or areas in your sample. Via the geometric method, you go to orthogonal projection. You can also choose the maximum intensity projection, but also the average intensity projection. And average means that it's not going to oversaturate. It will just calculate an average of all the pixels throughout your Z-stack. You also have a weighted average, which you can compare to another intensity projection called extended depth of focus. Now always first define the input image and then define the thickness, which is Z, that you want to apply to the final processed image. The average and the weighted average can sometimes give you nicer images than the extended depth of focus. If there are large intensity differences within the image, the extended depth of focus might give you black holes in the image or striping. And this can be prevented by using average or weighted average. So here, for example, you see at the MIP in red are the oversaturated parts. Also in the extended depth of focus, you can have some oversaturation, but much less. But I don't know if it's visible nicely, but you can also have some black holes involved, which is not the case in the other two. Stitching, we all acquire tiles, or most of us acquire tiled images, because we want to see a larger area than the one single image. Typically, stitching is done during image acquisition on the confocal microscopes. On the wide field microscopes, you have to apply it afterwards. Now, one thing to remember is that if you acquire tiled images with LSM 880, 700, or 710, always try to apply a 10% overlap, minimally a 5%, I would suggest, and then process the stitching in ZenBlue. ZenBlue can definitely recognize those images and can do a much nicer job for stitching than the ZenBlack can do. Additionally to that, very importantly is, once you change in the parameters in place to new output, you also get access to a few styles and especially correct shading. Now, correct shading can occur in two ways. It can define it automatically based on your image. It tries to estimate the shading in your image. What the shading means that the corners, for example, are darker and the other part of the image is brighter. Or, as in this example, you have a very bright top in the image, and then it fades away until the next line of image, and then again very bright up and fades away to the bottom. Shading correction can solve this and give you still a very nice homogeneous intensity throughout the whole image. That can be done in the Zen blue stitching. Again, this is an example of something that can be applied automatic when you're working on the cell observer or the axial zoom. And then last but not least, when you're acquiring time series, if you have some fast-moving or even slow-moving objects, it can be interesting to apply a gliding average. With the gliding average, you actually smoothen some objects that are jumping around or noise in the background. As you can see here, you see some flickering, which is noise in the background. Also, some of the cells that are moving around are jumping. Here, I took an average of 3 images. So in my time lapse, I will take 1 to 3, 2 to 4, 3 to 5, and so on, and calculate an average image of that, and then recreate again a time lapse. And the result, as you can see here, is that you get a much smoother image, you get a much smoother time lapse image. Movement is also smoother. Movement is not affected though, so objects that are moving at speed x will still be moving at speed x. Just smoothened out. The noise is also removed. It can be definitely of interest as well. And with this, I would like to conclude. As said, if there are questions, please feel free to ask now or pass by CPI, and we can definitely help you further as well.